I have presided over thousands of disputes in my decades on the bench. I have seen every type of betrayal, every broken promise, and every excuse in the book. But there was one case involving a staggering $20,000 dental implant bill that, for years, remained a testament to human arrogance and the absolute necessity of hard evidence. It wasn't about the money. Money is just paper, and paper can always be replaced. This was about something much more fragile. It was about the cruelty of someone who thought they were untouchable, and the sheer audacity of a man who believed that a written promise meant nothing if he had enough ego to deny it. The morning the case arrived in my courtroom, the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of unresolved resentment. Before a single word was spoken, I watched the plaintiff, Emily Dawson, sit perfectly still at her table. Her hands were folded tightly, her knuckles white, her posture rigid. She wasn't just nervous. She looked like someone who had been holding her breath for months, waiting for a permission to exhale that she wasn't sure would ever come. There was a specific kind of sadness in her eyes, the look of a woman who had been gaslighted for so long that she was beginning to doubt her own reality. Across the aisle sat the defendant, a man who believed the world was his personal playground. He was well-dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his hair immaculate. He leaned back in his chair with an air of practiced indifference, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. In my experience, that level of confidence is almost always a mask. It's the kind of confidence that comes from a life of never being held accountable, a life where you simply steamroll over anyone who stands in your way. He looked like a man who wasn't even bothered by the prospect of a lawsuit because, in his mind, he had already won. The dispute appeared simple on paper. Emily Dawson was seeking reimbursement for $20,000 she had spent on urgent dental implant surgery following a traumatic accident. According to her, the defendant had explicitly promised to cover the cost. He, in turn, denied any such agreement. His defense was simple. I never promised to pay for your surgery, and if I did, it was merely an expression of sympathy, not a binding contract. Simple, clean, or so he thought. Believe me, after enough years on the bench, you learn that the simplest stories often hide the most complex webs of deceit. And that morning, as I called the court to order, I had a feeling this wasn't going to be the simple he said, she said case he was expecting. I watched him, and I knew he was about to get a very rude awakening. I looked at Emily and gestured for her to begin. The courtroom, usually a place of sharp rebuttals and legal jargon, went deathly silent. Emily didn't look at the gallery. She kept her eyes fixed on me, then drifted toward Daniel, who was still wearing that infuriating faint smile, a smile that seemed to say, "This is a waste of my time." Emily's voice, at first, was a mere whisper, trembling with the residual trauma of a woman who had been forced to relive a nightmare. She started at the beginning, 3 years ago. They weren't married, but they were a couple in the eyes of everyone who knew them. There were shared holidays, weekend trips, and the kind of future plans that imply a lasting commitment. She spoke of the trust she had placed in him, not just as a partner, but as her protector. Then, she moved to the weekend that broke everything. They were at a lake house, the kind of place where you go to forget the world, not to have your life shattered. She described the afternoon, a day that started with laughter and ended in an emergency room. It involved recreational equipment on the property, a freak accident, and a sudden, visceral impact that left her crumpled on the grass. She didn't need to describe the medical gore. The photos of her facial injuries, which I had reviewed in chambers, spoke volumes. She had lost teeth, endured fractures, and faced months of grueling, painful reconstruction. But the most critical part of her testimony, the part that made the air in the courtroom grow thin, was the immediate aftermath. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek and told me, clearly and firmly, that Daniel had not hesitated. He hadn't called a lawyer. He hadn't checked his finances. He had looked her in the eyes, amidst the chaos of the emergency room, and promised, "Don't you worry about the bill, Emily. You're with me. I'll take care of every single cent. Just focus on your recovery." That promise was the anchor of her entire case. It wasn't just a verbal agreement. It was an assurance given at a moment of extreme vulnerability. It was the reason she felt secure enough to proceed with the expensive, necessary surgeries instead of opting for cheaper, subpar alternatives. She had trusted his word. I watched Daniel as she spoke. His smug smile hadn't vanished, but it had tightened, turning into a thin, hard line. He was doing that thing that arrogant people do when they think they've already won. He was dismissive. He was shaking his head, just enough for the jury to see, as if she were telling a fairy tale. But in my courtroom, I don't just listen to the words, I watch the eyes. And Daniel Carter wasn't looking at Emily with pity or even anger. He was looking at her with annoyance. He was annoyed that she had the nerve to hold him to a promise he clearly regretted making. I leaned back, my pen hovering over the notepad. This was the crux of the moral dilemma. People make promises in the heat of the moment, thinking they are grand gestures, only to realize the financial weight of those words later. But the law doesn't care about your regrets, and it certainly doesn't care about your ego. A promise made is a debt incurred. I needed to see if he was going to stand by his word, or if he was the type of man who would tear up his own character just to save a few $1,000s. I looked at Daniel and asked, "Mr. Carter, are you planning to interrupt every time the plaintiff speaks? Or would you like to wait for your turn to explain why you abandoned your word?" I watched as the plaintiff's attorney, a man who clearly understood that this case was about character rather than mere dental expenses, stepped toward the evidence table. The room grew unnervingly quiet. It was the kind of silence that precedes an earthquake, the moment when the truth threatens to dismantle a carefully curated narrative. The attorney opened the file. It wasn't a mountain of documents. It was a simple, damning sequence of digital records. Daniel sat there, still trying to project that untouchable energy I see so often in men who think their status makes them immune to the consequences of their actions. But I saw a flicker of something new behind his eyes. Caution. Not guilt, yet just the sudden, cold realization that he was no longer the one steering the conversation. "Mr. Carter," the attorney began, his voice calm and methodical, "is it your testimony today that you never offered to cover Miss Dawson's medical costs?" Daniel didn't hesitate. He sat up straighter, smoothing his lapels. "That is correct," he said, his voice as polished as his shoes. "I expressed concern. I was a supportive partner, but a legal obligation? No. That is a misunderstanding of a simple human gesture of goodwill." It was the kind of answer a high-priced lawyer feeds a client to protect them from liability. It was precise, cold, and utterly detached from the reality of what actually transpired between these two people. The attorney didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply projected the first text message onto the courtroom screen for the entire gallery to see. It was dated 2 days after the accident. It read, "Don't worry about the costs right now. I'll take care of everything. Just focus on healing." The room gasped. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at the screen, then at his own attorney, his untouchable composure, taking its first real hit. The message was clear. It wasn't merely an expression of sympathy. It was an unequivocal assumption of responsibility. When the attorney asked if this was his phone number, Daniel faltered. "Well, I mean, the context matters," he stammered. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. I knew exactly what was happening. We were witnessing the beginning of the end of his charade. He thought his name and his bank account would protect him from the truth. He was about to learn that in my courtroom, justice doesn't care who you are or what you've bought. "Mr. Carter," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "The text is written in plain English. Unless you have a dictionary I don't know about, that sounds like a promise to me." Daniel looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't have a rehearsed answer. He had nothing. The air in the room shifted, turning from skepticism to certainty. Emily sat a little straighter, her eyes finally finding the strength to meet his gaze. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a witness to his unraveling. The weight of his own words was starting to crush him, and we were only getting started. "Mr. Carter," the attorney said, his voice laced with the cold precision of a surgeon, "you just testified under oath that you never agreed to cover Miss Dawson's medical costs." Daniel wiped his forehead, a bead of sweat now glistening under the harsh courtroom lights. "I didn't. I told you those texts were just supportive. It was a relationship. You help people you care about. It doesn't mean I'm legally bound to hand over a blank check for $20,000. He was sweating now. The untouchable facade was slipping, replaced by the frantic energy of a man who realized he'd been playing a game with rules he didn't fully understand. The gallery, which had started the morning leaning back in their seats, was now collectively leaning forward, eyes locked on him like hawks. They weren't whispering anymore. The silence in the room had become absolute. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that happens right before a dam breaks. I sat back, observing the scene. Years on the bench teach you to read the subtle language of the body. When a man is innocent, he is usually outraged by the accusation. He fights back with raw, unfiltered emotion, perhaps even a bit of righteous anger. But when a man is guilty, he fights back with logic, with context, with carefully crafted excuses. Daniel was fighting with excuses. He was trying to rationalize his way out of a corner he had built himself. So, to be clear, the attorney pressed, "You were just being supportive when you sent this message, and this one, and this one?" He clicked through a series of texts on the courtroom monitor. Each one showed Daniel not just offering empty support, but actively micromanaging Emily's doctor appointments, discussing the recovery timeline, and even debating which surgeon to use based on cost effectiveness. It wasn't the behavior of a casual friend or a distant partner. It was the behavior of a project manager overseeing an expense he had already committed to. Daniel's legal team was whispering frantically, their heads together, looking as though they were trying to put a sinking ship back together with duct tape. I tapped my gavel once. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Mr. Carter, I'm not interested in your definition of supportive. I'm interested in your definition of the truth. You've claimed under oath that you made no such promise. Is that still your position?" Daniel opened his mouth, but for the first time, nothing came out. He looked at Emily. For the first time all day, she was the one with the calm, steady gaze. She knew exactly what was coming next. The attorney didn't wait for Daniel to find his voice. He reached into his folder and pulled out a small, unassuming electronic device. "Your Honor, in addition to the text messages, we have audio evidence of a phone call placed by Mr. Carter to Miss Dawson 3 days after the procedure. It is a voicemail left on her phone." The color didn't just drain from Daniel's face, it vanished entirely. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Every ounce of his manufactured confidence evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked terrified of his own shadow. The room seemed to shrink, all eyes turning from the defendant to that small device, waiting for the truth to be unleashed. The silence in the courtroom was not just an absence of sound, it was an entity of its own. When the technician pressed play, every head turned to the speakers. For a man like Daniel Carter, who had built his defense on the shifting sands of supportive gestures and misunderstanding, those few seconds of audio were a wrecking ball. The voice that emerged was clear, unmistakably Daniel's. It was the same calm, confident, professional tone he had been using to deceive this court, but the content was a confession. "Emily, listen to me," the recording said. "I don't want you stressing over the money. The implants, the specialists, the recovery time, whatever it costs, I'll cover it. You trusted me enough to come on this trip, and this happened because of something under my watch. I'll make it right." As the audio played, I watched Daniel. The transformation was total. The smug, faint smile that had defined his demeanor since the moment he walked into my courtroom was gone, replaced by a gray, hollow look of defeat. He couldn't even look at his lawyer. He stared fixedly at the polished wood of the table, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own words were physically pressing down on him. In my courtroom, I've often said that character is revealed when the bill arrives. Daniel had spent weeks trying to rewrite history, trying to turn a moral obligation into a charitable favor. He had banked on his ability to manipulate the narrative, to use his confidence as a shield against the truth, but he had forgotten the most basic lesson of the courtroom. Truth has a way of rising to the surface, and it is usually far more resilient than any lie. The silence that followed the recording was even heavier. The jury members looked at one another not with questions, but with the cold, hard realization that they had been lied to. Emily, for her part, didn't look at Daniel. She looked at the floor. She didn't need to say a word. The recording had spoken for her. I turned my gaze toward the defense table. Daniel's attorney was frantically scribbling notes, likely trying to calculate how to salvage a sinking ship. He had argued that this was just an emotional promise made in a crisis, but the voicemail was more than that. It was an admission of responsibility. It was the evidence collapse that we all knew was coming. When power attempts to use a name or status as a shield, it eventually finds that truth is the only weapon that never misses. I sat back, watching the clock tick. Daniel Carter was about to learn that in this room, accountability is the only currency that matters. The silence in the room was brittle, like glass waiting to shatter. Daniel stood there, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand so hard his knuckles turned white. He was scrambling, his mind clearly racing through every possible lie he could sell, every excuse he could invent to escape the hole he had dug for himself. He finally looked up, his eyes darting around the courtroom, desperate to find an ally, a loophole, anything. "Your Honor," he started, his voice cracking, shedding that veneer of unshakable confidence he had worn like armor all morning. "That recording, it's out of context. I was stressed. I was trying to de-escalate a volatile situation. When I said I'll cover it, I didn't mean all of it. I meant I would help. That's not a contract. That's just a conversation between two people who were close. She's taking a kind gesture and trying to turn it into a legal trap. I didn't blink. I didn't shift in my chair. I just stared at him, letting his words hang in the air, allowing everyone in that courtroom, the jury, the bailiff, the gallery to hear the sheer desperation behind them. "Mr. Carter," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a sharpened blade. "Do you think I'm a fool? I've heard every version of 'I didn't mean what I said' in the book. A promise isn't a suggestion. It isn't a maybe. It isn't a mood. When you look someone in the eye or, in this case, record it on their phone and tell them you will take care of a bill. The law views that as a binding commitment. You don't get to retroactively redefine your word because the price tag ended up being higher than you liked. That is not how the world works." Daniel stood there, shifting his weight, looking smaller than he had 5 minutes ago. He was trying to pivot, to paint himself as the victim of his own kindness. It was pathetic. This was the peak of his arrogance, believing that he was so clever, so inherently superior, that he could talk his way out of a recorded admission. He tried to bring up his business, mentioning the unforeseen financial strain of his current projects, as if his inability to manage his own money somehow absolved him of his moral and legal duties to Emily. I had seen this dynamic 1,000 times. The powerful man who thinks he can outmaneuver the system, who believes that if he throws enough legal jargon at the wall, something will eventually stick. He was still trying to negotiate, still trying to trade his integrity for a few $1,000s. He didn't understand that the trial wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that he was standing in a court of law, in front of a judge, continuing to lie even when his own voice had already convicted him. The audacity was breathtaking. And the worst part? He genuinely seemed to believe he was the injured party in this scenario. He looked around the room, as if expecting someone to step forward and agree with him. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He was completely alone in his own mess. The defense team was scrambling. It was a pathetic sight to behold, watching high-priced lawyers attempt to build a barricade out of excuses that were already burning to the ground. Daniel, no longer the composed businessman, was leaning heavily into his counsel, whispering with a frantic intensity that suggested he was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that his money couldn't buy his way out of the truth. His lawyer, sensing the tie and the room had collectively decided Daniel was a liar, finally abandoned the misunderstanding defense. He stood up, smoothing his tie, and attempted a tactical pivot, a move I have seen in every courtroom across the country whenever a defendant realizes they are losing the moral high ground. "Your Honor," the defense attorney said, his voice strained, "my client did intend to fulfill his obligations. However, circumstances changed. Since the accident, Mr. Carter has faced unexpected business losses and severe financial pressure. It was not a matter of refusal, but of inability. He intended to pay, but his liquidity was compromised." I looked at Daniel. He nodded along, trying to adopt a look of somber regret, as if he were a victim of a cruel economy, rather than a man who had tried to stiff his former partner for a bill he had explicitly promised to cover. It was a classic move. When you can't win on facts, you play the victim. But in my courtroom, I don't buy into the hardship narrative unless I see the ledger to prove it, and I had a feeling that if we looked at his ledger, we wouldn't see hardship, we would see excess. The plaintiff's attorney, clearly a man who had done his homework, didn't flinch. He simply walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick stack of bank statements. He didn't even open them yet, he just held them up like a weapon. "Mr. Carter," the attorney began, his voice calm, cutting through the murmurs in the gallery, "you speak of financial pressure. Is it your testimony that your assets were so severely impacted that you couldn't meet this obligation?" Daniel took a breath, likely preparing to launch into a sob story about business overhead and market volatility. "Yes," he answered, the lie feeling heavier in the air this time. "It was a very difficult period. I had to prioritize." I watched the plaintiff's attorney smirk. It was the smile of a hunter who had the prey exactly where he wanted. This wasn't about whether he could pay, it was about whether he would. And I was about to show the court exactly why Daniel Carter's financial hardship was nothing more than a convenient, expensive myth. The air in the room felt electric now. We were approaching the final reveal, the moment where the last of his defenses would be stripped away. The gavel strike was sharp, effectively ending the suffocating silence that had gripped the courtroom for the last hour. I looked down at Daniel, whose composure was now entirely shattered, and delivered the final verdict. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a mandate. I ruled in favor of the plaintiff, Emily Dawson, in the full amount of her claim, plus all applicable court costs. It was the only outcome that made sense in a room where the truth had been so thoroughly dismantled and exposed. The weight of the judgment seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He didn't argue, he didn't protest, he simply nodded, a mechanical gesture of defeat. He knew he had finally reached the end of the road. As I watched Emily gather her papers, I didn't see a woman who had just won a battle. I saw someone who had finally laid down a burden that should never have been hers to carry. She wasn't celebrating, she was breathing. That, to me, is the true definition of justice. It's not about vengeance, and it's not about the destruction of the other party. It's about restoring the balance that was unfairly tilted. She had spent months doubting herself, trying to navigate a reality that the defendant had deliberately warped, and today that fog had lifted. As they both exited, I couldn't help but reflect on the nature of the man who had just walked out of my courtroom. Daniel Carter had entered with an air of invincibility, banking on the idea that his bank account, his social status, and his ability to spin a narrative would insulate him from the consequences of his actions. He learned today that those things are illusions. They crumble the moment they come into contact with the solid rock of the truth. My final thoughts were for the gallery, for everyone watching, and for Daniel himself, even though he was already halfway out the door. We live in a society that often rewards the loudest voice and the deepest pocket. We are taught that if you have enough influence, you can bend the rules, you can delay, and you can outlast your responsibilities. But today proved that such a worldview is nothing but a house of cards. Integrity isn't a performance you put on when the cameras are rolling or when a judge is looking. It's the quiet, often difficult choice to keep your word when you think no one is watching and when you think there is no one who can force your hand. That is the true measure of a man. Daniel Carter came here believing he could outrun his word. He failed, and in that failure he received the most expensive lesson of his life. When power fails, character is all that you have left.